The Forbidden Room of Holloway House. When we moved into the old Holloway house in Willow Creek, Virginia, I was filled with excitement. I had always dreamed of living in a historic home with its rich past, unique character, and the charm that only age could bring. The house had an air of elegance, with its grand columns, gabled roof, and ivy that crept up the walls like nature's lacework. It seemed like the perfect place to build new memories with my family. My husband, Mark, shared my enthusiasm, eager to restore the house to its former glory, and even our daughter, Emily, seemed captivated by the charm of the old colonial mansion. She ran through the hallways with a joy I hadn't seen in her since we left the city. But from the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, carrying a damp, musty scent that seemed to cling to my skin. There was an inexplicable coldness that seeped into my bones, an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. At first, I tried to brush it off as just my imagination, maybe even a draft from the old windows, but the feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Mark was quick to attribute it to the house's age.
It's just an old place, Maria.
He said with a reassuring smile, wrapping his arm around me.
Once we get the heating fixed and air out the rooms, it will feel more like home.
I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about the house felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Then, Emily began talking about her new friend, Sarah. At first, we thought it was just a child's imaginary playmate. Kids invent friends all the time, right? But then things started to change. Emily would talk to Sarah for hours, whispering and giggling in her room. She even set an extra place at the table during meals, insisting it was for Sarah. Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances but laughed it off.
She's just being creative,
Mark said.
She'll grow out of it.
But it didn't stop there. The whispers began at night, soft and almost playful, drifting through the air like a lullaby carried on the wind. They seemed to come from all around us, from the walls, from the floorboards, and sometimes from beneath the bed. Then came the footsteps, light, like those of a child pattering down the hall when Emily was fast asleep. One night, I heard a faint, distant giggle echoing through the house. I felt a chill creep down my spine, an unnatural stillness settling over the room. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. I glanced over at Mark. He was still fast asleep, oblivious to the strange sounds. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hall toward Emily's room, but the sound seemed to move away from me, deeper into the house, as if leading me somewhere. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hall stretched out longer than it should, the shadows thick and dark. I reached a door at the end of the hall, the only door that wouldn't open, no matter how hard we had tried. The door was solid, ancient wood, with a faded brass handle, and it was always locked. We had assumed it led to a closet or a storage space, something mundane. But now, it felt like the center of the house, a place that was alive with its own secrets. Emily had become obsessed with that door, insisting that Sarah lived inside and wanted to come out to play. I began to feel uneasy whenever I passed it, noticing shadows moving beneath the crack, hearing faint sounds that almost resembled crying. Sometimes when I stood close enough, I thought I could hear breathing, shallow and uneven. I wanted to ignore it, but something drew me toward it, a compulsion I couldn't explain. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences became more frequent. Emily's conversations with Sarah grew more intense, her laughter echoing through the halls even when she was alone. She began to change, her behavior becoming more erratic, her mood swinging from sweet and affectionate to cold and distant in the blink of an eye. She spent more and more time in her room, and I would hear her talking in hushed tones, giggling, and then nothing, just an unnerving silence that seemed to fill the entire house. Mark remained skeptical, always finding a logical explanation for everything.
It's just an old house.
He would say, running his fingers through his hair in frustration.
They creak, they groan. And Emily, she's just going through a phase, don't worry.
But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The house seemed to breathe around us, its walls shifting, its floors creaking even when no one was there. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the soft patter of feet running down the hall, the distant sound of a child's laughter echoing in the dark. One night, after another sleepless night filled with whispers and footsteps, I'd had enough. I stood up, my heart racing, and whispered to Mark, "We need to open that door. I need to know what's behind it." He hesitated, looking at me like I had gone mad. But the look in my eyes must have convinced him. Reluctantly, he nodded, and we retrieved a crowbar from the garage. The wood around the doorframe was old and brittle, and as we pried it open, it splintered and groaned, almost as if it were screaming. With one final heave, the door swung open, and what we found inside made my blood run cold. The room was perfectly preserved in time, untouched by age. Dust covered the floor, but everything else looked as if it had been frozen in a single moment decades ago. A small bed with a faded quilt, a wooden chest filled with toys, and a rocking chair next to a window that had been boarded up. But what caught my attention was the doll. A porcelain doll sat on a dusty chair, its glassy eyes staring directly at me, almost as if it was alive. Its mouth was painted in a faint smile, but there was something about its expression that made my skin crawl. Emily squealed with delight and ran to the doll, clutching it tightly. "Sarah!" she cried, laughing, spinning in circles with the doll in her arms. From that moment on, Emily was different. She became distant, her eyes glazed over, as if she were lost in her own world. She would sit in that room for hours, talking to the doll, playing games that no one else could see. I tried to take the doll away one day, just to see how Emily would react. She screamed, a sound so shrill and filled with rage that I barely recognized her voice. "No! Sarah doesn't want to go," she cried, tears streaming down her face. I backed away, my hands trembling, feeling a deep, creeping dread settle over me. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps closer. I could hear them even when Emily was right beside me. The soft patter of feet running down the hall, the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the dead of night. I felt as though the house itself was watching us, waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had awakened something that had been sleeping for a long time. One night, I awoke to the sound of crying, a soft, pitiful sobbing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I rushed to Emily's room, my heart in my throat, only to find her standing by the door to the forbidden room, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty. "Sarah wants to come out," she whispered, her voice hollow, not quite her own. "She wants to play." I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "Emily, honey, come away from there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with those wide, vacant eyes. I reached out to take her hand and she flinched, pulling away. "She says you don't understand," Emily murmured. "She says you don't want us to be friends." I stared at my daughter, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "Emily, please, you need to come back to bed." She turned slowly, her expression shifting, a smile spreading across her face that didn't look like hers. "But we're having so much fun," she said, her voice lilting, almost mocking. "And now that the door is open, Sarah doesn't want to be alone anymore." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Some doors should never be opened, I whispered, mostly to myself, but it was too late. I knew deep down that the house had chosen, and it wasn't going to let Emily go. From that night on, the activity in the house intensified. The shadows grew darker, thicker, creeping along the walls like tendrils of smoke. The air became colder, and the whispers turned into wails, anguished, desperate cries that echoed through the halls at all hours. Emily's behavior grew more erratic. She began drawing pictures of a little girl over and over again, with wide black eyes and a smile that stretched too far. I tried to talk to Mark about leaving, but he just shook his head.
We can't just abandon the house. We've put too much into it.
But I knew the house wasn't ours anymore. It belonged to whatever was in that room, whatever had claimed Emily as its own. One night, I woke up to the sound of a music box playing a slow, haunting tune. I followed the sound, my heart pounding, and found Emily standing in the dark hallway, holding the doll and whispering to it. "She says you should come play with us," Emily said, turning to me, her eyes dark, her expression blank. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. I knew then that Emily was slipping further and further away, and if I didn't do something soon, I would lose her forever. But the house had already made its choice, and it wasn't going to let her go. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed our bags, determined to get Emily out of that house, to save her from whatever had taken hold of her. But when I went to her room, she was gone. I searched every corner, every crevice, calling her name. But all I heard in return was a soft, mocking giggle that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I rushed to the forbidden room, my heart in my throat. The door was open, swinging slowly back and forth on its hinges. I stepped inside and the cold hit me like a wave. The room was empty except for the doll, sitting on the chair, its eyes fixed on me, unblinking, its smile wider than before. "Emily," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. But there was no answer, just the faint sound of laughter, drifting away, deeper into the darkness of the house. I knew then that Emily was gone. She had become part of the house, a new playmate for whatever spirit had been waiting there all those years. And I was left alone, trapped in the hollow, empty shell of the house, with the door to the forbidden room forever open. And from that day on, every time I hear the faint sound of a child's laughter in the hall, I wonder if it's Emily, or if the house is just playing tricks on me again.
The house at the end of Deadwood Lane. From the moment we decided to take a vacation in rural Maine, I felt a strange pull, a curiosity that gnawed at me like a whisper in the back of my mind. Michael and I had heard the legends, stories told in hushed tones by locals who avoided even mentioning the place's name. They spoke of a house deep in the backwoods, a house that seemed almost forgotten by time. The Thatcher House, they called it, sitting at the end of Deadwood Lane, surrounded by dense woods and an eerie silence so deep it could swallow sound. It was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to escape the monotony of Boston life and indulge in some thrill-seeking. We set out one sunny afternoon with nothing but a map, a packed lunch, and a sense of excitement. But as we drove further into the wilderness, the road grew narrower, the trees loomed thicker, their branches intertwined overhead like skeletal fingers blocking out the sky. It felt like we were being funneled down a dark, narrowing tunnel of green. I swore I saw shapes moving among the trees, shadows flickering just out of sight. Michael dismissed it as my imagination, but the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, and a chill ran down my spine. By the time we reached the overgrown trail that led to the house, the atmosphere had changed completely. The sky, once clear, darkened with clouds that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, carrying with it a sound almost like whispers. I could swear the trees leaned in closer, their branches creaking, as if they were trying to warn us away. Or worse, draw us in. I wanted to turn back, a tight knot forming in my stomach, but Michael insisted. He was always the adventurous one, always pushing the boundaries. So we pressed on, pushing through the thick underbrush, our shoes crunching over dead leaves and twigs, until we finally saw it, the old Thatcher house. It stood there like a sentinel, a forgotten relic from another time. A 2-story Victorian mansion with peeling paint, shuttered windows, and an air of decay that seemed almost palpable. The house seemed to exude a presence, a dark energy that reached out like tendrils, wrapping around us, pulling us closer. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, my heartbeat quickening. The rusted iron gate creaked as we pushed it open, and I swear I felt eyes watching us from one of the upstairs windows, though the curtains hung still. The path to the front door was overgrown with weeds, and the grass was long and wild, swaying in the wind as if alive. The steps groaned under our weight as we ascended, and the front door, heavy and wooden, swung open with a groan that echoed like a low moan throughout the house. Inside, the smell of mold and rot hit us like a wall. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and dust danced in the slivers of light that managed to pierce the gloom. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. I shivered as we wandered from room to room, each one more unsettling than the last. The walls were stained with something dark, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners, swaying in the draft like ghostly veils. I felt cold spots as we moved, patches of frigid air that seemed to bite at my skin. I heard faint whispers, like distant voices speaking just out of earshot, and shadows seemed to shift and move at the edge of my vision. I tried to ignore the dread building in my chest, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I glanced into a cracked mirror hanging on the wall, my breath caught in my throat. Behind me, reflected in the dirty glass, was the face of an old woman, her eyes wide, her mouth twisted in a grin that sent a wave of terror through me. "Michael," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to leave." He nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. We turned and rushed back to the front door, but it wasn't there. Where the door had been, there was now a solid wall of bricks, cold and unyielding. I reached out, running my hands over the rough surface, panic surging through me. "No, this can't be," I murmured, my voice shaking. I turned around, my heart pounding, and heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending the stairs behind us. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I grabbed Michael's arm, my fingers digging into his skin. A woman's voice, cold and raspy, whispered from the darkness.
"You came, now you belong to me."
The room dimmed, the shadows deepening, closing in around us. I heard the sound of nails scratching across the wooden floor, the noise growing louder, closer. I clung to Michael, my heart racing, a scream caught in my throat. I could feel the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in. I realized then that we were trapped in a place where the dead still roamed, where the walls seemed to breathe, and the living were never meant to escape. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, yawning abyss of the hallway, stretching further than it should. Michael squeezed my hand.
"We need to find another way out."
He whispered, but I could hear the fear in his voice. The shadows seemed to thicken, the air growing colder still. I felt something brush against my cheek, soft but ice cold, like a hand. I gasped, stepping back. "We need to move," I said, my voice breaking, but my legs felt like lead. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was descending the stairs, wanted us to know it was coming. And then, from the darkness, came a soft, low laugh, a sound that sent chills through my entire body.
Welcome!
The voice whispered.
You're home now. The curse of Elderwood House. As a paranormal investigator and YouTuber, I prided myself on exploring some of the most haunted places in the country. But there was something about Elderwood House that felt different, even before I laid eyes on it. I had heard the stories, the tales of the unexplained deaths, the mournful cries of the elderly echoing through the night air, the shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. This place had a reputation, and I knew I had to see it for myself. Max, my cameraman, was less enthusiastic.
I don't know, Amanda.
He had said as we drove through the dense woods of Brattleboro, Vermont.
This one feels bad.
I dismissed his concerns with a wave. Come on, Max. Don't tell me you're scared. We're professionals, remember? And the channel's views are going to skyrocket after this. But deep down, a part of me was unsettled too. The road narrowed and twisted through the woods, the trees growing thicker and darker, like an impenetrable wall. The GPS lost its signal. We drove in silence, the tension between us mounting as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The shadows grew long, stretching across the path like dark fingers reaching out to pull us in. When we finally arrived, the sight of Elderwood House made my heart skip a beat. It sat in the middle of a clearing, its crumbling facade almost hidden behind thick, overgrown vines. The windows were broken, their frames blackened and scorched. The air grew colder, and a strange heaviness settled over me, pressing down on my chest like a weight. Max and I exchanged a nervous glance. I approached the front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the rusty handle. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed like a scream in the still air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just disturbed something that should have been left alone. The darkness inside was thick and heavy, almost alive. I felt it surround me as I stepped inside, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. "Are you getting this, Max?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.
Yeah, I'm getting it.
He replied, but his voice was strained.
But Amanda, something doesn't feel right.
I forced a laugh. That's the point. Come on, let's check the attic first. The stairs creaked beneath our weight, each step echoing in the silence. The air grew colder as we ascended, and I could feel a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I ignored it, focusing on the job. When we reached the attic, the air was so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And then, there it was, the rocking chair. It moved slowly back and forth with no one touching it. The creak of the wood seemed to grow louder, echoing off the walls. I felt my heart quicken. I approached it, feeling the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Is there someone here?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "If you want to communicate, give us a sign." For a moment there was nothing, just silence. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it. "Help! Us!" I froze, my blood running cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Max. He nodded, his face pale.
Yeah, I heard it. Amanda, maybe we should...
Before he could finish, the door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the temperature dropped even further. I heard more voices now, clearer, all overlapping, begging for help, crying out in anguish. I turned to Max, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes.
We need to get out of here,
he said, his voice tight with panic. I nodded, feeling a chill run through me. We hurried down the stairs, but the air seemed to thicken, and I felt something cold brush against my cheek, like a hand reaching out from the darkness. I shuddered, my breath quickening. "The basement," I said. "We need to check the basement." Max hesitated, but I was already moving. We reached the basement door and pushed it open. A foul odor hit us, a mix of decay and something metallic, like old blood. The basement was dark, the shadows deeper and darker than they should have been. I switched on my flashlight and saw them, chains hanging from the walls, stained dark. I moved closer, the beam of light trembling in my hand, and then I saw him. A man, his face twisted in agony, his eyes hollow, filled with something that looked like anger or desperation. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I lifted the camera, trying to capture him, but the screen flickered and the lights went out. I felt something cold touch my shoulder and I gasped, spinning around. "Max," I whispered. But Max wasn't there. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I felt my pulse quicken, and my hand tightened around the camera. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, suffocating, relentless. And then I realized with a sinking dread that the dead didn't just want their story told. They wanted company. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned, heart pounding, and everything went black.
The Haunting of Rosewood Manor. It was supposed to be a fun night, a thrilling adventure with my college friends. We had all heard the stories about Rosewood Manor, a massive Victorian house in upstate New York with a reputation that made it infamous. A house known for its dark history and the chilling events that seemed to plague anyone who dared to enter. Naturally, we couldn't resist the challenge. A night in that house would surely give us the scare we craved, maybe even a story to tell for years to come. We arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The house loomed before us, its windows boarded up and its doors barely hanging from rusted hinges. The paint was peeling, and vines clung to the exterior like desperate fingers trying to pull the house back into the earth. The surrounding woods seemed to close in around it, the trees like claws reaching out, as if the forest itself wanted to reclaim it. I felt a shiver of doubt run through me, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that this was a bad idea. But I pushed it down. We were here to prove we weren't afraid. Inside, the air was heavy, almost oppressive, with a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Every step we took on the old, creaking floorboards echoed through the empty halls, each creak sounding like a low moan. The sensation of being watched was immediate, an unmistakable prickle at the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. We decided to split up to cover more ground. Classic horror movie mistake, I know. But we were young, stupid, and eager to prove our bravery. I wandered down a long, narrow hallway, my flashlight flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, and there were dark stains on the floor that looked disturbingly like old blood. I tried not to think about it. I turned a corner and found myself facing a tall, ornate mirror. I stared at my reflection, trying to steady my nerves, and then I saw it. A figure standing just behind me, grinning, its face twisted in a way that sent a jolt of fear through me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but my heart was racing and my hands were shaking. I continued down the hall, but the air felt thicker, almost like wading through water. And then, without warning, the doors began to slam shut one by one, trapping some of my friends in different rooms. I heard their voices, shouting, panicked, and then a scream. A child's scream, high-pitched and terrified, echoing through the hallway. I ran toward the sound, but the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the walls twisting and warping as if the house itself were shifting around me. I felt a surge of panic, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I turned a corner and froze. There she was, a little girl standing in the hallway, her dress tattered and her skin pale. Her eyes were black, hollow, and empty. She opened her mouth and a scream erupted, louder than anything I had ever heard. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was too late. The sound pierced through me like a knife, cutting into my very soul. I stumbled back, feeling the walls closing in around me. The house seemed to be breathing, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs, the air thickening. I tried to find my friends, but the corridors twisted and turned, leading me in circles, trapping me in a maze that shouldn't have existed. I felt like I was running in place, my legs heavy, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows grew darker, deeper, and I could hear whispers now, low, guttural, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I saw the little girl again, standing at the end of the hallway, but this time she was smiling, her teeth sharp and glistening in the dim light. I felt a chill run down my spine, my breath catching in my throat. I turned and ran, but the floor seemed to tilt beneath me, the walls stretching and twisting like they were alive. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, getting closer. I glanced back and saw a shadow moving along the wall, its shape shifting, growing taller, reaching out with long, slender fingers. I realized, too late, that Rosewood Manor wasn't just a house. It was a trap, a living entity that had claimed more than just our attention. It had claimed our souls. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper. I felt a hand brush against my back, cold and clammy, and I stumbled forward, my heart pounding in my chest. And then everything went dark.
The Whispers of Stone House. As a horror novelist, I had always been drawn to places with dark histories. Places where the air itself seemed thick with secrets and shadows lurked in every corner. Stone House was one such place, a remote, eerie mansion on the outskirts of Coldwater, Texas. I had heard about it in passing, whispered rumors in the local cafe about a house that seemed to absorb light, a house where the sun never shone quite as brightly. It was said to be built entirely of cold gray stones that seemed to pull the warmth from your bones like a magnet for all that was dark. The perfect setting for my next novel, or so I thought. I rented it without a second thought, imagining the isolation would help me focus, clear my mind, and finally finish the book I had been struggling with for months. I told myself that the solitude would be invigorating, the perfect escape from the noise of the city. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of my decision settle on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls were pressing in on me. The stone floors were cold beneath my feet, and the air felt thick and unmoving. I could taste the dust on my tongue, feel the age of the house in every breath I took. The rooms were unnaturally cold, even though it was the middle of summer and the heat outside was stifling. I shivered, feeling a prickle of fear at the back of my neck, but I brushed it off as nerves, just my overactive imagination getting the better of me. I unpacked my bags, placing my laptop on a small wooden desk by the window that overlooked the overgrown garden. The garden was a tangle of weeds and dead flowers, the once beautiful rose bushes now shriveled and brown. I tried to write, to lose myself in my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was too complete, too oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I felt as if the house were watching me, waiting. And then the whispers began. At first they were soft, almost like a distant conversation just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but they were always there, just on the edge of my consciousness, growing louder with each passing day. I would turn, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was never anyone there. Just the empty room and the shadows that seemed to dance just at the edge of my vision. I started seeing things, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, flickering like specters in the dim light. My reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. My face would shift slightly, my eyes darker, as if something else was looking back at me. I found myself staring into the mirror for long stretches, trying to catch whatever it was that lurked just beneath the surface. At night, the house seemed to come alive. The floors creaked, the walls groaned, and the whispers grew louder. I heard screams, faint and distant at first, then louder, more desperate. They echoed through the halls, filling the rooms with a haunting melody of anguish. I began to lose sleep. I would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts that weren't mine. My writing grew jumbled, incoherent, as if my thoughts were being scrambled by some unseen force. One night, after another sleepless, tormenting stretch of whispers and shadows, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was causing it. I had to understand. I remembered the basement door, the one door in the house that had remained closed since I arrived. The door seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were a living thing, breathing in the dark. I knew it was a mistake the moment I opened the door. The smell hit me first, a mix of mold, decay, and something metallic, like old blood. The stench was so strong it made my eyes water, and I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the top of the stairs, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, drawing me down. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air grew colder with every step, a biting chill that cut through my clothes and settled into my bones. I shined my flashlight around, the beam flickering and weak. The basement was a dark, cavernous space, the walls made of the same cold gray stone as the rest of the house. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. As I moved further into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight fell on something that made my blood run cold. Chains hanging from the walls, old and rusted, covered in a thick layer of dust and something darker, something sticky and red. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw claw marks gouged deep into the stone, desperate, ragged scratches that spoke of something or someone trying to escape. I felt a cold breath against my neck, and I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there, but I could feel them. Dozens of eyes watching me from the darkness, the air thick with malice and despair. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, surrounding me, filling the air. "Help us," they said. "Let us out." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the spirits here were not just ghosts. They were prisoners, trapped in this place, tormented for eternity, and they were angry, desperate for release, desperate for someone to take their place. I turned to leave, my hands shaking, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I lunged at it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers became a cacophony, filling my ears, pressing in on me from all sides. I felt the air grow thick around me, almost like it was solidifying, trapping me in place. I knew then that I was trapped, and if I stayed any longer, I would become a part of the legend myself. I screamed, banging on the door with all my strength, my fists pounding against the wood until they were raw and bleeding. The cold tendrils of darkness crept closer, wrapping around my legs, my arms, pulling me down. I felt them, the spirits, pressing in closer, their cold, clammy hands reaching for me, pulling me toward them. And then I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps descending the stairs, coming closer and closer. The sound was heavy, each step sending a jolt of fear through my body. I turned, my back pressed against the door, my flashlight flickering. The beam fell on a figure at the top of the stairs, a dark silhouette, its features obscured by the shadows. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, descending one step at a time. I could hear the soft whispering growing louder, like 100 voices speaking at once, all pleading, all desperate. The figure reached the bottom step, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Its eyes were glowing a sickly yellow, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a low, raspy hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. "Now, you belong to us." I felt a cold hand wrap around my wrist, and I screamed, yanking my arm away. The figure moved closer, its form shifting, its features changing, becoming something monstrous, something inhuman. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, pressing in from all sides, and I knew I had to get out. I had to escape. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it at the figure, but it passed right through like a knife cutting through smoke. The figure laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the basement. I felt hands grabbing at me, pulling me down, and I kicked out, thrashing against the invisible grip. I could hear the whispers now, clear and distinct, a chorus of voices begging, pleading, screaming. "Help us," they cried. "Release us." I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I knew I was running out of time. Desperately, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help. But the screen was dark, dead, the battery drained. I cursed under my breath, my mind racing, trying to think of a way out. And then I remembered. The chains hanging from the walls, the ones that seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. I reached for one, my fingers trembling, and grabbed hold, pulling with all my strength. The chain rattled, and I felt a surge of energy, a shock that ran through my body. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I felt the grip around my ankles loosen. I pulled harder, my muscles straining, and the chain came free, clattering to the ground. The air seemed to crackle with electricity, the darkness retreating just a little, and I knew I had to keep going. I moved to the next chain, yanking it free, and then the next and the next. Each one fell with a loud, echoing clang that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The whispers turned to screams, high-pitched and desperate, and I could feel the spirits pulling back, retreating into the shadows. With one final pull, I yanked the last chain free, and the room seemed to explode with light. I felt the cold tendrils around my legs release, and I stumbled forward, grabbing the door handle. It turned easily now, and the door swung open, flooding the basement with light from the hallway. I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. I could hear the screams fading behind me, the whispers growing softer. I burst through the front door into the warm, bright sunlight of the outside world and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. I looked back at Stone House, its dark, brooding silhouette standing tall against the bright blue sky. The whispers were gone, the screams silenced, but I knew the spirits were still there, waiting, watching. I had escaped, but just barely. The house had released me, but I knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. As I got into my car and drove away, I glanced back at the house in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a face in the window, staring back at me, its eyes glowing yellow. I turned away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I knew I would never return to Stone House, but I also knew that it would never truly let me go.